Welcome to the Executive Innovation Show podcast, where we bring you real executive conversations with industry game changers and thought leaders. We ask the questions you're thinking, what you're scared to ask, and we make your brain hurt afterward. With your host, Carrie Chitsey Wells, co-founder and CEO of One Touch Video Chat, live video interviews, and the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. We have a great show with us today. It is going to be part of our Mental Health Month for May, brought to you by the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans, who's raising awareness on the opioid crisis and mental health. I'm so excited to have with us today. I have the Oklahoma Attorney General, Mike Hunter, who was elected the state's 18th Attorney General on November 6, 2018. One of his top priorities has been the safety and security of all Oklahomans, and his primary initiative has been to end the state's opioid overdose and addiction epidemic. So happy to have on the show and talk about the big win against Pharma and the opioid crisis. Attorney General Mike Hunter, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Carrie. Thanks for having me on, and I want to say I appreciate you and your team's dedication to educating the public in this area of mental health and substance abuse.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the fight that you've been doing in Oklahoma. I've been watching it, and, you know, you've been really leading the charge of, in my mind, one of the top attorney generals in the U.S., really fighting back on Pharma and fighting back on all the work that you've been doing. And I want to talk about some of the recent wins. But before we do that, I want to really talk about the state of the opioid crisis and really how it's affected Oklahoma. Your team was able to provide some great statistics of why you're really passionate about how it's affected Oklahoma. I want to go through some of those just so the listeners know kind of a little bit of the background. And so between 2004 and 2018, there's been over 10,000 overdose deaths driven by the opioid epidemic in Oklahoma. In 2018, there was 3,000 non-fatal overdoses reported by hospitals, 80% related to prescription opioids. In the last 15 years, the drug overdose deaths in Oklahoma have increased by 91%. In 2016, in 14 counties surrounding Tulsa, there was enough prescription opioids available for every person to have 90 pills. Between 2015 and 2018, there were over 18 million opioid prescriptions filled in Oklahoma. 66% of drug deaths were related to prescription opioids. And the DHS indicated that parental substance abuse is the second reason cited for child removal. Now, those statistics are pretty eye-opening. There's a lot of states that have, similar and, worse statistics. But is this what really made you passionate about going after the pharmaceutical companies, or did you start somewhere else and end up there? Tell us a little bit of the backstory.
Well, those data points are what they are, jarring, eye-opening, all sorts of adjectives come to mind. As we sat down and after I was actually, after I was appointed to this job in 2017, and as you said, I was elected to it in November of last year, we started establishing some priorities for public safety in the state. And as we looked at the various challenges we had on the criminal justice front, consumer protection, the opioid epidemic was something that really established itself as an area that needed direction and leadership from the Office of the Oklahoma Attorney General. So our approach has been threefold. Number one, we were convinced that the state needed more policy assistance, more tools, more assets to deal with the epidemic at the state level. Secondly, it was important to us to start being really tough and really focused on the law enforcement piece of this, particularly with respect to drug dealers. And lastly, we determined that the prime mover behind the epidemic was the oversupply of prescription opioids. So those were the three areas that have been sort of our tripartite approach to the epidemic in the state. Again, policy, law enforcement, and lastly, holding opioid manufacturers accountable for the epidemic in Oklahoma. So with the policy challenges that we identified, the legislature authorized the Oklahoma Commission on Opioid Abuse. And we had stakeholders as members of the commission from the medical community, physicians, mental health professionals, law enforcement, private sector, representatives on the commission, and then legislators. We had a very holistic approach to the issues in determining what kind of policy changes the state needed to stem the epidemic. And throughout our work, we came up with 7 pieces of legislation. They all made it to the governor's desk last year and were enacted into law. We, among other things, we have more oversight on distributors who are bringing pills into the state. We mandated e-prescribing, and that will eliminate paper prescriptions and prescription forgery eventually.
That's awesome.
We also determined, to our dismay, that the possession of fentanyl was not a crime, and that was something we addressed. And for your listeners, fentanyl is maybe the deadliest substance that's on the street right now. The fentanyl equivalent.
Elephant tranquilizer.
Pardon?
Elephant tranquilizer.
Yes, in effect. And as little as a few grains of salt, the equivalent of, is enough to kill someone. And before our legislation, it wasn't a crime to possess fentanyl without a prescription. So we continue to meet. We're looking at more ways. The commission continues to meet. We're looking at more ways to deal with the epidemic, again, from a policy standpoint. So law enforcement, we are investigating and shutting down pill mills.
That's great.
It's my belief that, Carrie, folks need to understand that a majority of doctors, the great majority, do exactly what they need to do to treat their patients. But there's a small fraction of doctors that view this as a opportunity to make profit, and I hate it. But when we identify people that are putting profit ahead of their patients and are functioning like drug dealers, we are treating them as such. I'll just give you a quick example. We charged a doctor with 5 counts of second-degree murder in 2017 for the death of 5 of her patients. So our investigation revealed that the 5 individuals who died were prescribed more than 1,800 opioid pills
Jeez.
in the same months as their deaths.
Wow.
And 3 of the 5 were prescribed a deadly 3-drug combination of narcotic opioid pain reliever and anti-anxiety drug and a muscle relaxer. And all those prescriptions were signed by the doctor. And we've that individual's been bound over for trial later this summer. So that's an extreme case, but it certainly, I think, gives people a bit of a context for a situation where a doctor is just really acting outside of the scope of what their responsibilities are to their patients. And with regard to drug dealers, my attitude is if you're going to be entrepreneurial about dealing drugs, if you're going to make that your job, if you will, your enterprise, and the people you sell drugs to end up in the emergency room or worse, on a slab in a morgue, you've committed a violent crime.
Right.
And so we're dealing with drug dealers in that fashion. On the other hand, if your crimes or if your problem is exclusively an addiction and you need to have your condition addressed, we're also thoughtful and informed about that. Addiction's a brain disease. We need to do everything we can when somebody becomes addicted, and frequently it's through no choice of their own. They're prescribed drugs for an injury or something, and 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 5, based on research, that's the percentage of people who are vulnerable to addiction, and there's no screen for that. So
Right.
we're being thoughtful and result-oriented with regard to folks who need help, who are dealing with an addiction. But if you're dealing with drugs and somebody, again, is injured as a part of that transaction or die, the worst case, we treat that as we have in the past. That's a first-degree murder charge with regard to drug dealers. So that's our law enforcement piece. And as you mentioned, we've got our lawsuit here in the state against drug manufacturers. And we settled with one of those defendants recently, and I'm happy to talk about that.
Yeah, so I want to talk about that. I really admire that, Purdue Pharma, obviously everyone, most people know that, they're the the top dog, the manufacturer there. And there's been a lot of states, there's been a lot of government go after, and they've purely just kind of got a slap on the wrist. Tell me a little bit I admire that you weren't scared to go after that battle, because that is such a big battle. And it's amazing that you've gone after the pill mills, you've gone after the drug dealers, but to fight that guerrilla, just a few weeks ago, you reached a historical settlement with Purdue Pharma for over $200 million, and that'll go to endowment at the Oklahoma State University for wellness and recovery to treat the ongoing addiction nationwide. But there was also some other big wins in that. Tell me a little bit, not only, where did you have kind of the drive and the pushing up the chest to be able to go up against them? And then what else was, there were some other big wins in that settlement for Oklahoma.
Well, Carrie, I've got a great team here. The legal team, both the outside firms that are working on behalf of the state and the attorneys here in the office of the Oklahoma Attorney General have really done heroic work for the last 20 months. And the progress that we'd made towards trial, which is scheduled to occur next month, May 28th, down in Norman, Cleveland County, Oklahoma. That was really the impetus for that, gave us the leverage, the momentum to get Purdue into a negotiation with regard to a settlement, which was really high stakes poker, because there'd been, as your listeners probably notice if they follow this issue, there'd been a lot of public modeling for Purdue with regard to bankruptcy options. They've been sued by over 1,000 plaintiffs around the country. They're a privately owned company, closely held. So bankruptcy was a serious option for them. And so our delicate exercise was, can we settle with Purdue without putting them in bankruptcy? Because the other sort of specter as we move towards trial was Purdue, telling us, at least in a side fashion, that we do not expect to go to trial in Oklahoma.
Right.
So our challenge was, can we craft a settlement with Purdue that is meaningful, that will help us here in Oklahoma address the epidemic. But Purdue's challenge was, give us a proposal that has national importance, and we will seriously consider it, because they have to do a multiplier of 50 as they settle with states. And so the opportunity that we had here in Oklahoma with the OSU's medical school in Tulsa had established a groundbreaking program, really cutting edge, with regard to addiction science. Their Center for Wellness and Recovery, they just in 2 years had established already a national footprint, had received millions of dollars in grants. So our response, our proposal to Purdue was fund this. It can not only help Oklahoma with regard to ensuring that we've got the best treatment and addiction science behind how we deploy funds to help our citizens, but it can be a national asset. So that's ultimately what drove the negotiations. That's when we really were able to get momentum, with regard to Purdue. But the bulk of that money, as you said, will go to the OSU Center for Wellness and Recovery in Tulsa. It is at right around $200 million. There are other, as you said, elements to the settlement. We set aside $12.5 million that will go to political subdivisions in the state, cities and counties, helping them deal with the challenges that they've had as political subdivisions, as I mentioned, in dealing with the epidemic. And as a part of the settlement, Purdue agreed that there's an injunction as a part of the court decree that they will not promote opioids in Oklahoma.
That's amazing.
They won't employ or contract with sales reps. So that was an important part of the settlement.
Yeah, that's critical. That's insane. That's awesome. Congratulations. That's great. So, yeah, I think that has really kind of set the stage for other, states. And as you said, there's been this bankruptcy talk going on that, has stalled a lot of things. But what advice would you have for other states and other attorney generals that are fighting the opioid crisis based on, you've really paved a nice, path here. You've done some amazing work after the dealers, the pill mills, the legislature, going after big pharma. What advice would you have, looking back on kind of this journey that you've come so far on, and you still got some road ahead of you on some fights coming up on May 28th?
So our approach, if as you say, if that's a case study or a template for other states, our approach was we got what we felt were the best law firms, the best legal team that we could identify with regard to expertise in big cases. I'll just mention as an aside, I'm not sure that this can be replicated in other states, to have the two lead counsel that we have in Oklahoma and have their experience with the epidemic, personal experience. So two very fine lawyers lead our team, former federal judge Mike Burridge and his law partner Reggie Whitten. They're both members of the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, have won big cases over their careers, incredibly well regarded, but they're also victims of the epidemic.
Yep.
Judge Burridge lost his niece to an opioid overdose, and Reggie Whitten's son, very fine football player, Brandon, played college football, was injured frequently, prescribed opioids, became addicted, and ultimately lost his life to an opioid addiction. So they're not only, pouring all their expertise and experience and legal skills into this case, they're really pouring their heart and soul into our work here, because at the end of the day, they want the lives of their loved ones to mean something. And so that's I think an important part.
I think it's critical.
How we've been able to not only pour, talent and expertise, but resolve and a commitment to an outcome that really is going to benefit the state and help us get on the other side of this epidemic. So we've worked hard. We've taken hundreds of depositions. We've looked at millions and millions of documents. So I guess my advice would be, you need to take this case seriously. You need to ensure that you've got the best legal talent available, and your commitment needs to be very focused, laser focused on approaching the problem in your state as the objective in your trial. Here are the injuries our state has suffered. Here's the challenge we have, and our evidence supports what the state needs to address the epidemic in a conclusive, decisive way, and that's what we're going to tell a jury. That's what we're going to tell a judge. So, simply put, you need to take this seriously, and you need to make sure that the legal team you put together is tough and proportional to what's going to be on the other side with respect to the defendant's lawyers. They'll get the best lawyers in the country, which the defendants in this case have. We still have our trial coming up in May against principally Johnson & Johnson and Teva. They've put incredibly tough, focused, and hard-charging lawyers on this case, and so you really got to have a legal team that's up to the challenge.
Doesn't back down, right? So I want to go back for a second. You talked about you had you put together a commissioner council, in Oklahoma when you really started, figuring out what you're going to do with the opioid crisis. And I think to your point, of all the states and different industry leaders that we've talked to on the show, really that passion, I think everybody has that's fighting the opioid crisis outside of, city, state, nonprofits, leaders, whatever, has a personal story, has a passion about the opioid crisis and has had direct effect on their family and or friends. When you were looking at starting that council of healthcare professionals, mental health, addiction, local entrepreneurs, I think you had on the council and so forth, did you look for not only, what you're doing today, but just kind of throwing out, what you've been doing? I think a lot of the states and cities that are receiving, federal grant dollars and so forth, they're a little scared to go outside of the box with some of that grant money. Did you guys, from kind of an innovation or creative standpoint, bring in folks that had this kind of personal passion and try to come up with ways to, obviously creating new legislator and things like that? I would assume the answer would be yes, but how did you look at it from that perspective of getting the different opinions and kind of do something different than what you've been doing that wasn't working?
So our approach was to seed the commission with the professions that you mentioned, and then draw on not only their experience but their network of connects around the country, their counterparts in other states. Again, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, law enforcement. We had prescribers on the commission, and so both within the state and without the state, we really looked for the best research, best information that we could gather, again, based on the commissioners,
right,
and their background, experience, and connections. So we looked outside the state. We looked for best practices, again, based on conversations with professionals in those various disciplines around the country. We looked for best practices in states. We drew on what was going on in Oklahoma that was unique and specific to Oklahoma. And then there was sort of a synthesis process as we got to the end of our work, where we identified the most important deliverables that we thought were prompted by the research, the presentations, the discussions that the commission had, again, with both inside and outside the state, people who were dealing with the epidemic. And so all that I think came together rather smoothly with regard to getting the legislation drafted, getting the legislature informed and motivated to get the bills passed, getting them on the governor's desk, and getting them moved into policy. So that was the approach we had. The commission is still in existence, and I don't want to say we're fine-tuning. We're just
right.
We're looking at ways to perfect what we've done and then to do more, again, to give the state the tools it needs to fight the epidemic.
Awesome. So last question, what does success look like for you in this opioid crisis for Oklahoma? If you're sitting back, a few years from now, you're past a lot of this legal stuff. What does that look like? What do you want that kind of legacy to be when you fought against this opioid crisis? What does that look like for you?
Well, I'll start with law enforcement first. We want this state to be a very undesirable, a very non-economic destination for those who want to sell street drugs. So that's the approach. We've got really good partnerships, Carrie, with not only state and local officials, but with federal law enforcement. And so the boots on the ground element to all this is important. So I guess that's the first data point. We want to make Oklahoma not a place to be in the business of dealing drugs. Secondly, just from a statistical standpoint, bringing those who are losing their lives to the drugs down by significant percentages with each succeeding year is important.
Yep.
We've got, I think, really good collaboration with prescribers now. The pill limits that are in place are actually, I think, working very well as prescribers begin to understand the importance of being very careful, very judicious, and in a very limited way prescribing opioids for chronic pain, principally after surgery.
Yeah.
Obviously, opiates are still very relevant for palliative care. And then there are folks there's a subset of folks whose conditions are so severe that there really aren't options. We like to say pill limits are in place for the opioid naive, for people that don't understand. And because there's no screening, the important part of limits is to ensure that there's no more pills being given on the front end, again, for chronic pain after surgery and such, than is necessary. So that deals, hopefully over time, you're going to significantly avoid addiction. With the OSU research component, the Wellness and Recovery Center, not only is it an aspiration, but I think that it is a high probability that we're going to come away with a way to screen people so that we know if they've got this vulnerability. And our fondest hope is for, in a focused way over some period of years, for there to be an actual cure for addiction.
Yeah.
And again, that's a highly optimistic goal, but as Browning said, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for?
Yep.
We want to get the epidemic addressed. And lastly, we're optimistic about our ability to get a sizable settlement or judgment from these remaining defendants. And my hope would be, working with the legislature, that we'd be able to deploy those monies in a very comprehensive way to ensure that treatment is available for folks who have an addiction illness, and getting people that availability, getting them the treatment that's consistent with addiction science. And again, that's the piece that the OSU Center is going to play in dealing with the epidemic. So those are all, I guess, goals for where I'd like us to be in a few years. Some of it's optimistic, but I think some of it's very practical and very realistic.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. I think that we will continue to watch you guys' journey and, be cheering from the sidelines of your upcoming May 28th and what you guys are doing, and not only paving the way for Oklahoma, but paving the way for other states and the opioid crisis. So thanks again to you and your team. Everyone should really follow what Oklahoma is doing. They do a great job of posting updates on a lot of these cases and wins. Go to oag.ok.gov to get those updates, and follow Attorney General Mike Hunter at AG Mike Hunter on Twitter. Mr. Hunter, it has been such a pleasure. I appreciate you being on the show and everything that you've done. And so thanks again for being on the show today.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. Our trial starts on May 28th, and it will be televised. So,
oh, wow. That'd be great.
Yeah. So listeners, keep your eye open for that. As
where can we
Carrie said,
where can we find that?
Well, we'll have updates on our website, as you described them to your listeners. So they just need to keep their eye peeled.
Great. Well, we will definitely be keeping our eye peeled, and I'd love to watch that. So I will definitely be following that and cheering you guys on from the sidelines.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks so much for being on the show.
This podcast has come to a close. To hear more from the Executive Innovation Show podcast, subscribe, submit questions, and share the love. Follow us on social. We're everywhere.